This chapter is full of really familiar passages, familiar phrases. We have two I ams, the I am the gate, I am the good shepherd. We have numerous places where memory verses can be used from it by giving life and life in its fullness. There's lots in this chapter. But this chapter didn't exist on its own. This wasn't originally called chapter 10. It occurs within the context of what's just occurred in chapter 9 as we know it, and within the entirety of John's Gospel. And it's all about who is this Jesus. And in chapter 9, after healing a blind man who recognizes Jesus as Lord, the religious leaders are still puzzling over who he is and wrestling with what his claims are about himself. They can't discern who he is. They don't recognize his voice. They are effectively blind. And so here, Jesus uses a triple layered parable and a picture to convey truth to them. And the first layer of the parable is Jesus painting a picture which was very familiar to them, daily picture of sheep in a community sheep pen. In the Middle East then and now, mixed herds would be in a shared communal sheep pen. And what would happen is that the shepherd of a particular flock would come along to the gate and call his sheep, and he would call his sheep by name. They knew them by name. They still do this in the Middle East. And the amazing thing is, only his sheep would respond to his voice because of the amount of time that they spent together in the sheep pen, out of the sheep pen, in the fields. They recognized the voice and they recognized their names being called. And they followed this voice wherever it went. They were known and they knew that they were known. And Jesus is using the picture of a shepherd because it conveys something much more than the tranquil pastoral scene that we might be used to in Christian greeting cards of Jesus the Good Shepherd. The image of the shepherd and the sheep was well known in Scripture, and for the Jews it often was an analogy for the king and his people. In Ezekiel 34 in particular, which is a really important passage for John chapter 10 for understanding it, the ideal king is seen as the shepherd, and that's often based on the picture of David, the shepherd king, who was a man after God's own heart. And many had come over the years to claim the title of king or Messiah, and even we get to recognize one in this chapter about Hanukkah was a period of time they remembered one of those, a guy called Judah Maccabees, who was declared king because he threw out a pagan lord and established a Jewish king again. But that usually, these kings and these claimants usually had something to do with establishing their name and their rule, and sometimes often fleecing their own nest. So Jesus is posing this question: when the true king comes, how will you recognize him? Will you recognize his voice? He is the one who will come the way of the Lord, who will come through the gate, who will come the way that is recognizable as the way of God the Father. Faced with blank faces, people are going, we don't get what you're saying. Jesus goes on to layer number 2 in this picture. And you can imagine him saying, okay, you don't get, okay, let's try this then. I am the gate. And very often, especially in quickly made sheep pens out in the countryside, the shepherd would put down a circle of thickets and fences, and then there would be an open way, and he would lie down in the gateway. He would be the gate for the sheep. He would be the entrance and the exit. He would be protection against anything trying to get in and another way, he'd also be the one that was preventing the sheep from trying to get out. The shepherd was the gateway, and anything trying to get in any other way but through the gate would not have been the shepherd, but someone or something with destructive motives. And the thief, that's where Jesus talks about the thief who comes to kill, to steal, and to destroy. And it is the complete opposite of what the good shepherd wants, that wants life and life in all its fullness for the sheep. So he finishes this, and still blank faces. And so Jesus adds the final layer to this 3-layered analogy. I am the good shepherd. or alternatively can be seen the beautiful shepherd, the true shepherd. But this again is not just a pretty picture of some idyllic shepherd with a tea towel over his head. Not We're beyond that, because immediately there is a shadow being cast over this image that Jesus shares, which will resolve all the more over the rest of this book of John. And that is that the shepherd is not in this business of shepherding for his own personal reward, but because he loves his sheep, right to the point to be willing to die for them, willing to face any threat which comes near them and to take it head on. The shadow of the cross is looming very much over this. And this sheep flock is not just for Israel. There are other sheep that Jesus is trying to gather, and those other sheep are the Gentiles, those who've been excluded by the Jews, but for whom God chose Israel in the first place to be a light to them, to direct them to God, not to push them away. These other sheep, in fact, many of these sheep will recognize the shepherd's voice, even when there will be those within the original flock of Israel that don't. Those who've been excluded by the Jews will be included by the shepherd. But the only way this happens is that the shepherd is willing to lay down his life. Notice how many times that's mentioned. Jesus is so aware of what lies ahead of him, what constitutes the good shepherd. And yet he is willing to do this job, this dangerous, life-threatening job of the shepherd, this job of the ideal king, because he knows and he loves his sheep. And yet there are many listening who still don't get it, who still don't recognize his voice, who don't recognize the voice of God which is echoing out of every word uttered by this young Nazarene. And the chapter continues with the festival of Hanukkah, a festival of dedication, when thoughts turn to that would-be Messiah, Judas Maccabeus, by 200 years prior, who kicked out a ruler called Antiochus Epiphanes, who'd polluted the temple, and they rededicated the temple. And this is when people celebrated that with the festival of lights. And Judas became the king, but was eventually overthrown by the enemies. And so this was a time when the people thought about kingship. And Jesus is once again facing off with the leaders. And they want him to just be open and honest and say, tell us if you're the Messiah. And he says, I already told you, but you weren't listening, or you wouldn't believe. And he turns again to the picture of the sheep, recognizing his voice, and then onto the close relationship he has with his father. And on first look, these seem completely disconnected, until we understand that there's an underpinning image of the Good Shepherd back in Ezekiel 34. And within Ezekiel 34, there's a strange thing in that chapter. At first, the prophet speaks of God being the true or good shepherd of Israel. Then a little later on, he speaks of David, in other words, the Messiah, God's chosen one, of being the true and good shepherd. So which is it? Is it God, the good shepherd, or is it the Messiah who's the good shepherd? And Ezekiel doesn't resolve this, but instead casts the eye to the future. And here, in chapter 10 of John's Gospel, we see the answer to that conundrum. Only in Jesus are both true. He is Messiah, the Good Shepherd, but he is also God, the Good Shepherd. And his announcement in verse 30 is hugely dramatic. He says, I and the Father are one, indivisible. We are the same. We are joined together. We are one essence. And this is unmistakable to his listeners. This is not just about being a nice good shepherd who looks after a nice pastoral scene. This is Jesus making a statement. He's not only affirming that he is the Messiah, but he's also saying that he is God. And that is something that the authorities can't and won't accept.